Hi, and welcome to another edition of Rabbi K's Cuts, visual blasts of wisdom on the weekly Torah portion. This week's Parsha, we receive the Ten Commandments, very famous episode on Mount Sinai, which of course forms the foundation of our Jewish religion. Something very interesting is stated when the Torah is recounting its giving of the Torah. Just before the Torah is given, it says that the Jews were able to see the thunder and hear the lightning. Kind of a strange use of words, but nonetheless, that's what the Torah says. Rashi, the great commentator, jumps on this and says, we see from here that the Jews obviously were all able to see, meaning that even those who previously had been afflicted by blindness were suddenly now healed. They were able to see again. And he extrapolates that anyone with any ailment prior to the Torah being given was cured, was healed in advance of the Torah actually being delivered on Sinai. And the question, of course, is why? I mean, certainly the Torah is something that applies equally to someone who is healthy or unhealthy, God forbid, someone who is emotionally sound, not emotionally sound, whatever particular ailment a person has, ostensibly, Torah should apply equally to any of those individuals. Why was it necessary for God to heal people before he actually gave them the Torah? I read a beautiful answer from Rabbi Yochanan Zweig, who is a head of a yeshiva in Miami. And he said the following very, very profound and critical idea. People often tend to think of religion in the famous words of Karl Marx as the opiate of the masses, as something which inversely relates to those at the higher echelons of society. In other words, that those who are down and out, those who need some kind of succor, some kind of lifeline to bring them out of the doldrums, out of the destitution, out of the depravity of their lives, poverty and sickness, whatever other ailments are afflicting them. So religion provides a very wonderful and convenient tool and vehicle out of that suffering. But for someone who is wealthy, who is affluent, who is healthy, they don't need religion. That has been a common view of religion throughout much of history. Comes the Torah and tells us just the opposite. The Torah is not something which comes and addresses one's needs, one's emotional and physical needs, in the sense that only a person who is down and out, who's out on their luck, needs to reach out to Torah, to Judaism, as some kind of cure-all, some kind of panacea. Rather, Torah is something which can take the healthiest of people, the wealthiest of people, and give them a much more profound layer of meaning to their lives. Take their existing lives, their existing wholesome lives, and invest it with so much more power and so much more meaning. Invested with eternality, invested with transcendence, connected to something much broader and much bigger. Comes the Torah and says every person was healed so that they went to the Torah, they went to Sinai as full people who would now be given a much greater sense of connection. And that's why, says Rabbi Zweig, all of the Jewish people were wealthy when they left Egypt. They were able to plunder the riches of Egypt. When they went through the sea, the Red Sea, they crossed over. The Egyptians' gold and silver all floated to the top as they were drowned, and the Jews were able to take that as sort of a remuneration for their slavery, and they emerged as wealthy people. These wealthy people, wealthy and healthy people coming to receive God's Torah, demonstrates that the Torah is not the opiate of the masses, but in fact is something for all people, as great and as mighty and as wealthy as they might be at any time in their lives. Torah brings them to a whole different level. Sometimes we see people who seem to be very religious outwardly, and yet they do things that are very troubling, very disturbing. And we feel like this is Torah, this is a person who is representing the Judaism, representing Torah. And the reality is, very often, no. This is a person who is broken already, who is emotionally destitute. And he came and projected those shortcomings onto Judaism. Judaism is not something which creates an emotionally healthy person. It takes an emotionally healthy person and brings them to a whole different level, and brings them to a place where their emotional health, their sense of self can now be connected and made a part of a much greater tapestry. So let's not make the mistake of projecting Torah onto these people who themselves already are broken. Let's realize that Judaism is designed for a person who has a sense of self, has a sense of health, to come into it and to engage their full beings, their full selves, into building themselves into a much greater and more meaningful and more eternally impactful human being. Shabbat Shalom.